Arizona. Hope you're having a super fantastic, sparkling day. Welcome to Before the Dirt Nap podcast number 1990. Rooted in community, discovering ancestors' everyday lives. So you're doing your genealogy, which is all facts and figures. Facts and figures being birth, deaths, marriages, burial information, if there was a divorce in there, immigration. It's all facts and figures. It's all dates and places and times and things like that. And you find these records. And from that, you've got to glean a story about your ancestor. Did they come over on this particular ship, or was it this ship? Why did they leave where they were? That part there, the whys. So the genealogy is the facts and the figures. The family history, the family history side is the whys. What were their lives like? What did they do? What were their occupation can come under genealogy, but then you can find out more about the occupation to turn it into a family history story. So finding out information about your ancestors allows you to create a story about their lives and what it was they did. But today we're going to look at what did they do in an everyday life. We can look at their occupation and go, okay, they were a blacksmith. This is what they were responsible for. This is what they did. We see that they worked for the local community. They may have been the mayor of a town. They may have been a governor. They may have been a lord of the laird, that's in Scotland, I think it is, the laird, the lord of the thing, and they were tenants. That just tells you stuff about their lives. But then you get down a little deeper into what was their actual daily life like. What went on in their community that could hold records that can tell us more about our ancestors. So that's what we're going to look at tonight. So buckle up. You ready? We're going to do this in two parts because I've got 10 items on my list. And I was just looking through my list again and I thought, we might have to split this into two. So we're going to call this part one. Okay, we're going to cover the first 5 tonight. So on our first 5, we have the roles of churches. Churches were more than just a place of worship. They were the community hubs for socializing, education, and support. A lot of small towns, if they had a church there, it was quite often used for the town meetings. It was quite often used for the school, for the local school, and it was places where people would come as in a time of crisis. So if there was a crisis happening in the community, this is where they all gathered, was in the local church. Later on, things in some places didn't have a local church. They had a tavern or an inn or a pub, and those would be their places. And even though the tavern and the pub provided food and beverage and other things, because it was a central hub, they would also double as a place where they would have church. They would have the town hall meetings. They would have the school, and in all these cases as well, whether it was a church or whether it was the tavern or the pub or the inn, they also became the courthouse if they had somebody that they needed to have a court case for. So they would have a traveling judge that would come through. When they came through, everybody that would have been arrested would then be brought up on their charges, and they would face the judge. And quite often it was either in the church or the local community or the local pub, tavern, inn, whatever you want to call it. And inquests would also be held there too. So you'd have the coroner's inquest would be held there as well, with a body on display. Just push a couple of tables together, lay the body out, and let's have an inquest. Yes. Gruesome as it sounds, that is what it was. So some examples for church records that you'd be able to find would be like baptismal, marriage, and funeral records, which would be held in the church archive and the church records, because the church records would record everything that took place in the church. They may have a separate ledger for births, one for deaths and one for marriages. And of course with the deaths, there'll be the funeral when they were buried. Quite often they were buried in the churchyard. The town may have had a separate cemetery at that time. They may not. So at that time they were put into the churchyard. But based on their method of death, they may not have been allowed to be buried in the churchyard. If anybody committed suicide, if they were a criminal, they were not allowed to be buried in the churchyards. They had to be buried elsewhere. They were not allowed to be buried on consecrated ground. But the church would also hold like festivals and charity drives to unite the community together, and to help if somebody's house burnt down, they would all come together in a festival or charity drive to help rebuild that person's house. There were times in some of the rural areas where they did barn raisings, where the whole community would come together. They'd bring dishes along to share, potluck type. and they would have this barn raising exercise, barn raising day to get the sides up and maybe even the roof on, depending on how much work they got done in a day. The person who was having the barn build would provide all the lumber and everything else, and everybody would bring the tools and provide the labor, and they could actually get a barn raised in a day. So it was a pretty good way, and it was a community event. The woman would prepare the food and keep the children entertained while the men did all of the work in building the barn. The schools also was also an anchor in your community. These schools helped change children's lives and reflected the value of the community. Now, some children, based on their family and stuff, only went to school for a certain amount of time before they were then required to go and work on the farm or in the family business, whatever it was. If it was in a farm, if it was in a business in the community, they had to work to a certain age until they were able to take on those responsibilities in the family business, because their help may have been needed based on the demand. They got to attend school when the demand for the business was not high. You're going to find records. You may be able to find records that trace ancestors with attendance lists, teachers' rosters, yearbooks, class photos when photography became a thing. There'll be school events like putting on plays, putting on shows, doing a Christmas show at Christmas time, doing a sports day. To create a sense of belonging, they would have, community picnics that may be held wherever the school was held, which would be at a church or at a pub. They would have an area where they would come together and have a picnic, have a daily picnic, and different events would take place during that time. And it could be father-son races, it could be mother-daughter races, it could be father-daughter, mother-son, it could just be siblings racing against each other. There was different activities that they had that involved everybody, that would involve everybody in the community, or that people in the community could take part of. Then you had the local markets. In some areas, they didn't have grocery stores. You went to the market to get your fresh produce. The farmers would come in each day with their goods from their farm, or once every other day or once a week, with the fresh produce that people would then come and purchase until the next market took place. At the markets, you would also find those that had handcrafts that they were selling as well. So you could find all sorts of different gift ideas. There were those that did the portraits. There were those that did handcrafts, that they would come together. So think of like your flea markets that you have today, or local farmers markets and things like that. This started way back. And they would come together once a week, once every other day, depending on what was going on. Some of them would have carts that they would bring in every day and sell from the carts as they walked through the streets, or they'd set their cart up in one specific location. And again, the gossip mill was well in production. It wasn't called a gossip mill back then, but this was a way that those in outlying areas could catch up on the local news that was going on. The local, these markets would be informal meeting spots and news hubs. There'd be news passed backwards and forwards. This family just had another child. This family is having difficulty because of this. This family's got influenza in their place. This family's got da-da-da. So these is where all of this sort of stuff would take place, the passing of information. The news hubs, this was how they communicated back then. They didn't have a phone they could pick up and talk to. They would come together. And so this is where you can look at things like merchant or shopkeeper records, if they are still available. Have a look for those. Tax records, have a look for those as well. You may find family connections in there. Number 4, community events. They had fairs, festivals, town meetings, and this would help build the bonds of the community and help reinforce that community feel. You would have traveling fairs that would come through the little town or something, with the traveling like the traveling circus. When those started up, there'd also be the traveling plays that would come through as well. There'd be festivals to celebrate the I've only got 5 on my list. I thought I had 10. Sorry, I'm just my list is in front of me. I'm like, maybe I'll put the other 5 somewhere else. That's okay. I'll find them for tomorrow night. So you'd also have the traveling theatres that would come in and set up their tents or their stage and everything else on a field near the town, and everybody would then go over there. There'd be festivals, there'd be harvest festivals, there'd be Christmas festivals, there'll be all festivals throughout the year celebrating something, whether it was celebrating spring, the first harvest. When you got to Christmas time, there'll be arts and crafts brought out for that, but anything that would bring the community together. And these provided opportunities for political things to be political discourse, matchmaking, sharing of news. If you were of high society and you were in the bigger cities, they often had parks where the gentleman would be riding horses while the woman would be in carriages. And it was basically you were seeing a lot of single people there. But of course, the women were always escorted by a gentleman or a married lady would be with them. They weren't allowed to go by themselves. The men would all be on horses, and they basically the men just rode the horses around with these carriages paraded around the park, and they'd stop and talk and share news and all of that. They'd get to meet the young ladies who they would then meet at the debutante balls and the other ball. This is the ball season in the bigger cities when high society would come together, and there would be these different balls taking place, and depending which ball you got invited to, it would signify your status within that community, that society. And then the men would then come calling, and women could receive several callers to find her beau. And this is part of these community events, and that was the high society. In smaller towns and everything else, they had these fairs, these festivals, these town meetings, these things that brought the community together where they could meet. They could do matchmaking in those areas. They could share the news or the gossip, but mainly it was considered news. And in those cases, you might find local newspapers, photographs, or even event programs that may have been around, depending on the time era as well, as to when you would find these documents. Photographs didn't come along till later on, so at that time it would have been local newspapers. Sometimes the local newspapers had actual sketches. Somebody had done drawings in the papers to give you the likeness of the people they were talking about. And then you have community organizations, societies and clubs. There were women's groups, fraternal organizations, the men's groups, the men's clubs and things like that. This is when people of like minds would get together and have their own meetings and stuff. You'd have the women's groups, which would be, the knitting circle. They'd get together and they would knit clothes, or they'd have a sewing group going. And quite often in some of these smaller towns, even in the bigger cities as well, they'd have these sewing groups coming together because somebody could be getting married and they needed to fill up their hope chest a little more. What is a hope chest? A very good question. A hope chest was something that a woman would put together that would have everything she would need to start a house when she got married, like linens, bed linens. There would be the doilies that would go on for the decorating things. There would be towels that would get embroidered. There would be, she'd just collect all sorts of things, and a lot of it was handcrafts of things that she would need to set up house, is what her hope chest was. And so and in some circles, when a woman got engaged, they would have these sewing circles that would come together. Oh, and that's when they would make the quilts and all of those sort of things to go on the beds as well. And maybe the canopies, the drapes, and not even knowing what house they were in. But if somebody got engaged, then these women's sewing circles would start up, and they would come together to help make some of the bigger pieces, like the quilts and things like that. But there'd also be the tapestries that were done, and the embroideries that would be done on the doilies, and other decorative pieces that would be put throughout the house, and the pillowcases would get sewn as well. And even though the girl had done a lot on her own prior to that, when she was engaged, it was sort of like the rush was on to get stuff finished and completed. And so sewing circles would come together, create these beautiful quilts that would then be presented to the bride and groom, and that would be a community gift type of thing. But these, and then from those came other organizations and other groups, and then you had the suffragette movement in the late 1800s, and that actually went on further beyond the 1800s into the 1900s as well, where women wanted to have the votes. They wanted to have their say. They wanted to be heard. And how can you find information on these? Look for member lists, minute meetings, because some of these societies and clubs actually had formal meetings with their minutes, and they would put out newsletters. And so they may have a membership list. And so you need to, there'll be those, if you can find those records, they would be awesome to see who was there and were any of your, and if your ancestors were in that area, were they involved in some of these societies and clubs as well? So those are the first 5 that I have for you today. And we will talk about the others tomorrow. And yeah, I don't want to keep you guys too long tonight. It's the weekend. We're going to enjoy the weekend. So yeah, so those are just the first 5 things that we can talk about. And I'll quickly give you those things again. You've got the role of churches, and churches, pubs, taverns, all kind of in that area. They were a building where people came together for whichever reason. And sometimes the church wasn't an actual building. It was held in the local pub, tavern, and that sort of thing, along with the schools. Then there was the school, how that shaped children's lives and reflected values in the community. You also had the local markets and businesses. You had community events and community organizations. And tomorrow night, we will delve deeper into some of the other ones that were around during that time that your ancestors may have taken part of, that and how you can find records for those. So with that, we are out of here. Go out, have a super fantastic sparkling evening, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Pacific.